The morning Richard Holloway received the lawsuit papers, he sat in his mahogany office chair for 23 minutes without moving. The document accused him of financial negligence and emotional abandonment of his son Marcus. The plaintiff sought damages totaling $2.7 million for lost opportunities and psychological trauma caused by inadequate paternal support. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Richard read the papers twice, then placed them carefully on his desk next to the framed photograph of Marcus graduating from Stanford University. The same university Richard had quietly paid for without his son ever knowing. The same graduation where Marcus had told everyone who would listen that he was entirely self-made and had overcome the disadvantage of having a father who never supported his dreams. Richard Holloway had started working at 14, sweeping floors at Henderson Construction after school. By 16, he was reading blueprints during his lunch breaks. By 21, he owned his first piece of heavy machinery. At 38, he owned Henderson Construction entirely, having bought out his former boss's family when the old man retired. By 55, Holloway Industries had become the largest construction and development firm in 3 counties. None of this success came easily, and none of it came without sacrifice. Richard's first marriage ended when Marcus was 8 years old, not because Richard didn't love his family, but because 18-hour workdays left little room for anything else. Sandra, his ex-wife, moved to California with Marcus, claiming she needed to find herself, while Richard continued building the empire he hoped would one day provide security for his son. Every month, Richard sent Sandra 3 times the court-mandated child support. Every birthday and Christmas, expensive gifts arrived at Marcus's door. When Marcus turned 16 and expressed interest in a vintage Mustang he'd seen online, Richard quietly purchased it through a dealer and arranged for Sandra to surprise their son with it. When Marcus needed expensive tutoring to improve his SAT scores, Richard anonymously funded it through a scholarship program he created specifically for that purpose. The pattern continued through Marcus's college years. Stanford's tuition, room, and board cost Richard nearly $300,000 over 4 years. The study abroad program in Italy cost another $50,000. The unpaid internship at a prestigious architecture firm in San Francisco became possible only because Richard secretly supplemented Marcus's living expenses, funneling money through Sandra to maintain the illusion that his son was independent. After graduation, when Marcus struggled to find work in the competitive architecture field, Richard made discreet inquiries with his network of contacts. He learned that Thornfield Associates, one of the city's most respected architectural firms, was looking for junior architects. Richard had built 3 major projects for Thornfield over the years. One phony call to James Thornfield resulted in Marcus getting an interview. Marcus's portfolio and Stanford degree earned him the job, but Richard's relationship with the firm certainly didn't hurt. For the first 2 years of Marcus's career, he thrived. His designs were innovative, his work ethic impressive. He won a Young Architects Award and was featured in a local magazine article about rising talent in the city. In the article, Marcus spoke about his journey, emphasizing how he had overcome the absence of family support and succeeded despite having no connections in the industry. Richard read the article 3 times, each reading leaving a deeper ache in his chest. He cut it out and placed it in the same drawer where he kept every photo of Marcus he'd managed to obtain over the years, most of them secretly taken from Sandra's social media accounts. The distance between father and son had grown over the years, fed by Sandra's bitterness and Marcus's belief that his father had abandoned them for money. Richard made attempts to bridge the gap, but they were clumsy, awkward affairs. A dinner invitation here, a phone call there, all met with polite but cold responses. Marcus would show up to obligatory meetings looking successful and confident, but his eyes held the same hurt Richard remembered from when the boy was 8 years old and asking why Daddy had to work on Saturday again. Richard threw himself deeper into his work, convincing himself that building wealth was the same as building a legacy for his son. Holloway Industries expanded into commercial real estate, residential developments, and infrastructure projects. The company's success allowed Richard to be generous in ways he hoped might eventually matter to Marcus, even if his son never knew the source of his good fortune. When Marcus decided to start his own architectural firm at 28, Richard watched from afar as his son struggled with the challenges every new business owner faced. Permits that moved slowly through city bureaucracy suddenly accelerated after Richard made a few strategic donations to local political campaigns. Contractors who might have been reluctant to work with an unproven firm found themselves recommending Marcus's company to potential clients. A small office space in a prime downtown location became available at below-market rent through a subsidiary Richard controlled but had never connected to his own name. Marcus Holloway Architectural Design grew steadily over the next 3 years. The firm landed several high-profile projects, including a modern library that won a regional design award. Marcus hired 4 employees, moved to a larger office space, and purchased a sleek German sports car he'd been coveting for years. His success was real, his talent undeniable, but the foundation upon which it was built remained invisible to him. The irony wasn't lost on Richard that in trying to support his son while respecting his need for independence, he had created the very situation that now threatened to destroy their relationship entirely. Marcus genuinely believed he had accomplished everything through his own efforts, which made Richard's sacrifices not just unacknowledged but actively resented. The breaking point came during a family wedding 3 months before the lawsuit arrived. Sandra's sister was getting married, and both Richard and Marcus attended the reception. After several drinks, family members began sharing stories about the bride and groom's relationship, including the groom's touching gesture of paying for his fiancée's mother's medical bills when she was diagnosed with cancer. "That's what real love looks like," Sandra said loud enough for Richard to hear, "when someone actually shows up and takes care of the people they claim to care about." Marcus, emboldened by alcohol and surrounded by relatives who had spent years hearing Sandra's version of events, turned to face his father directly. "Some people talk about family responsibility," he said, his voice carrying across the reception hall. "I've never seen a dime of support from my father, never had a single door opened for me, never received anything but empty promises and birthday cards with money that felt more like guilt than love." The room fell silent. Richard felt every eye upon him, saw the satisfied look on Sandra's face, witnessed the pain and anger radiating from his son. He could have spoken up. He could have listed every sacrifice, every behind-the-scenes maneuver, every dollar spent. Instead, he stood quietly, finished his drink, and left the reception early. Driving home that night, Richard made a decision that would change everything. If Marcus truly believed he had received nothing from his father, if that belief was so central to his identity that he would proclaim it publicly, then perhaps it was time to make that belief a reality. The next morning, Richard called his attorney, Gerald Hoffman, and his accountant, Patricia Chen. He asked them to prepare documentation for every financial contribution, every favor, every string pulled on Marcus's behalf over the past 20 years. The list took 3 weeks to compile and filled a file folder 2 inches thick. Richard had Patricia calculate the total value of his contributions, direct payments, opportunities created, below-market rent, the difference between what Marcus paid for his car and its actual value, the cost of the connections that had led to jobs and contracts. The number was staggering, $4.2 million over 20 years, not including the compound interest that money could have earned if invested elsewhere. He had Gerald research the legal implications of what he was considering. Could he retroactively charge for services rendered? Could he call in debts that had never been formally acknowledged? The answers were complex, but the short version was yes, with proper documentation and under certain circumstances. Richard spent the next month making discreet inquiries about his son's business. Marcus's architectural firm was successful, but like many small businesses, operated on thin margins and relied heavily on credit for cash flow. The firm's major projects were profitable, but payments from clients often came months after expenses were incurred. Richard learned that Marcus had recently taken out a significant loan to expand his office and hire 2 additional architects. More importantly, Richard discovered that several of Marcus's current clients had originally been connected to his son through Richard's own network, though the connections were so indirect that Marcus had no idea of their origin. The library project that had won Marcus recognition had come through a city council member who owed Richard numerous favors from past development deals. The luxury condominium project that represented 30% of Marcus's current revenue had resulted from a recommendation by one of Holloway Industries' subcontractors. Armed with this information, Richard began making phone calls. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be traced back to malicious intent. He simply stopped making the kinds of calls that had smoothed his son's path for years. When city officials had questions about Marcus's permit applications, Richard didn't intervene. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. When contractors were deciding which architectural firm to recommend for upcoming projects, Richard's subtle endorsements disappeared. When Marcus's landlord considered whether to renew the below-market lease on his office space, Richard's subsidiary company decided to pursue market-rate tenants instead. The effects weren't immediate, but they were cumulative. Projects that Marcus had expected to secure went to competitors. Permit approvals that should have taken weeks stretched into months. The lease renewal on his office came with a 60% rent increase. Most significantly, 2 major clients postponed their projects indefinitely after running into unexpected bureaucratic obstacles that Richard could have resolved with a single phone call but chose not to make. Richard watched from a distance as his son's business began to struggle. There was no malicious pleasure in it, only a deep sadness at the necessity of the lesson. Marcus had built his identity around the belief that he had succeeded without help. Richard was simply making that belief retroactively true. The lawsuit arrived 6 months after Richard had begun his campaign of withdrawal. Marcus was suing not just for money, but for recognition of what he claimed was a lifetime of neglect and abandonment. The legal document painted Richard as a selfish, absent father who had chosen wealth over family and left his son to struggle alone in the world. Reading those words, Richard felt a mixture of pain and vindication. His son truly believed the narrative Sandra had constructed over the years. The invisible support, the quiet sacrifices, the careful orchestration of opportunities had been so subtle that they might as well have never existed in Marcus's perception of his own life. That evening, Richard sat in his study surrounded by financial records, legal documents, and photographs of a son who had grown up believing himself abandoned. For the first time since Sandra had left with Marcus 23 years earlier, Richard allowed himself to feel the full weight of his solitude. He had built an empire, accumulated wealth beyond most people's dreams, and engineered his son's success from the shadows. But he had failed to build the one thing that mattered most, a relationship with the person he loved more than anyone else in the world. The lawsuit demanded accountability for Richard's supposed failures as a father. Richard decided to give Marcus exactly what he was asking for, though perhaps not in the way his son expected. If Marcus wanted to hold his father accountable for every dollar of support he claimed never to have received, Richard was prepared to provide a comprehensive accounting. The war between father and son was about to begin in earnest, and Richard intended to win it not through cruelty, but through truth. Marcus would learn exactly what his father had done for him over the years, but the lesson would come at a price neither of them had yet calculated. Richard reached for his phone and dialed Gerald Hoffman's direct line. "Gerald," he said when his attorney answered, "I'm ready to respond to my son's lawsuit, but we're not going to fight it. We're going to embrace it completely." The older man's confusion was audible. "I'm not sure I follow, Richard." "Marcus claims I never did anything for him," Richard continued, his voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. "He's suing me for damages related to my supposed failure to provide support. I think it's time we gave him exactly what he's asking for, a complete accounting of what I actually provided versus what I should have provided according to his lawsuit." "Are you talking about a countersuit?" "I'm talking about something much more comprehensive than that," Richard said, looking out his office window at the city skyline his company had helped build. "I'm talking about undoing 20 years of support and seeing if Marcus's version of events holds up when he's actually living the reality he claims to remember." Gerald was quiet for a long moment. "Richard, that's a dangerous game you're talking about. It could destroy your relationship with your son permanently." Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Gerald, according to the lawsuit I'm holding, that relationship was destroyed years ago by my own neglect. I'm just making sure we're all operating with the same set of facts." As Richard hung up the phone, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: clarity. The time for operating from the shadows was over. Marcus wanted transparency about his father's contributions to his life, and Richard was going to provide more transparency than his son had ever bargained for. The next phase of Richard's plan would require careful coordination with several different parties. He needed to contact the various people and organizations who had been quietly supporting Marcus's career on Richard's behalf. He needed to review contracts and agreements that had been structured to benefit his son indirectly. Most importantly, he needed to prepare documentation that would demonstrate exactly how much Marcus's independent success had actually depended on his father's invisible network of support. Richard opened his laptop and began typing. The first email went to James Thornfield, the architectural firm owner who had given Marcus his first job. The subject line was simple: "Regarding Marcus Holloway, important update." "James," the email began, "I hope this message finds you well. I'm writing to inform you of a significant change in my relationship with my son Marcus that may affect your firm's ongoing interactions with him. As you know, I've maintained a policy of not publicly discussing my support for Marcus's career, but recent legal developments require me to be more transparent about these matters." The email went on to explain that Richard would no longer be providing the informal recommendations and relationship facilitation that had previously benefited Marcus's career. Richard made it clear that Thornfield was under no obligation to change how they treated Marcus, but wanted to ensure transparency about the change in circumstances. Similar emails went to city officials who had expedited Marcus's permit applications, contractors who had recommended his firm to clients, and business leaders who had provided opportunities based on their relationships with Richard. In each case, the message was the same. The quiet support that had smoothed Marcus's path was being withdrawn, and everyone involved should be aware of the change. The most difficult email to write was to the property management company that handled Marcus's office lease. Richard's subsidiary company had been subsidizing the rent for 3 years, allowing Marcus to operate in a prime downtown location for a fraction of market cost. The email instructed the property managers to terminate the subsidy and convert the lease to market rates immediately, as allowed under the rental agreement's clauses regarding changes in financial guarantors. By the time Richard finished sending the emails, it was nearly midnight. His study felt different somehow, as if the act of withdrawing his invisible support had changed the very atmosphere of the room. For years, this office had been the command center from which he orchestrated his son's success. Now, it felt more like a war room, and Richard was preparing for a battle he had never wanted to fight. The next morning brought the first consequences of Richard's email campaign. His phone rang at 7:30, and James Thornfield's voice was tight with concern. "Richard, I received your email last night, and I need to ask you directly. Are you telling me that the opportunities we've provided to Marcus over the years were influenced by your relationship with our firm?" Richard had expected this question. "James, I've never asked you to give Marcus work he didn't deserve, and I've never suggested that your firm compromise its standards. But yes, the fact that Marcus is my son has probably influenced how quickly his calls get returned and how seriously his proposals are considered. I thought you should know that dynamic is changing." There was a long pause. "Richard, this puts me in an extremely difficult position. Marcus is a talented architect, but if I'm being honest, some of the projects we've directed his way were influenced by our desire to maintain a positive relationship with Holloway Industries." "I understand," Richard replied. "I'm not asking you to change anything about how you treat Marcus going forward. I'm simply informing you that my previous policy of not discussing these matters publicly is ending. My son has made certain claims about our relationship that require me to be more transparent about the actual facts." After hanging up with Thornfield, Richard poured himself a cup of coffee and settled in to wait for the other phone calls he knew would come. His withdrawal of support wouldn't have immediate dramatic effects, but the cumulative impact would become clear to Marcus over the coming months. Projects would become harder to secure. Permits would move at normal bureaucratic speed instead of being expedited. The network of relationships that had quietly supported Marcus's career would neutralize, leaving him to compete on entirely equal footing with his peers for the first time in his professional life. Richard felt no satisfaction in what he was doing, only a grim determination to see it through. Marcus had built his identity around the belief that he was entirely self-made. Richard was about to find out whether that belief could survive contact with reality. The phone rang again. This time it was Patricia Chen, his accountant. "Richard, I've been thinking about our conversation last week regarding the comprehensive accounting of your support for Marcus. I need to make sure you understand the implications of what you're considering. If you document everything you've done for him financially and present it as a countersuit or debt collection, it could have serious tax consequences for both of you." "Explain," Richard said, settling deeper into his chair. "Well, if you've been making what the IRS considers gifts to your son indirectly, and you're now claiming they were loans or investments, that could trigger audits and penalties. On the other hand, if Marcus has been receiving benefits without claiming them as income, that could create problems for him as well." Richard smiled grimly. "Patricia, I want you to prepare the most comprehensive accounting possible of every dollar, every favor, every opportunity I've provided for Marcus over the past 20 years. I want to know exactly what my son's independent success has actually cost me, and I want it documented in a way that would hold up in court. And if that documentation reveals tax irregularities, then we'll address them as they arise," Richard said. "But I want the complete truth on paper, regardless of the consequences. My son is demanding accountability for my failures as a father. I'm going to give him a full accounting of my actual performance in that role." Patricia sighed. "Richard, I've been your accountant for 15 years, and I've never seen you make a decision based on emotion rather than logic. This feels different." "You're right," Richard admitted. "This is different. But sometimes the most logical thing to do is to stop pretending that emotional realities don't exist. Marcus believes I abandoned him. I'm going to show him exactly what abandonment actually looks like." After ending the call with Patricia, Richard walked to the window of his office and looked down at the city below. Somewhere out there, Marcus was starting his day, probably unaware that the invisible network supporting his career was quietly dissolving. It would take time for the effects to become noticeable, but they were already beginning. The first sign would likely be the office lease renewal. Marcus's current space was in the Meridian Building, one of the city's most prestigious business addresses. The below-market lease had been crucial to his firm's ability to project success and attract high-end clients. When that lease came up for renewal at market rates, Marcus would face a choice: pay significantly more for the same space or move to a less prestigious location that might hurt his firm's image. The second sign would be the slowdown in permit approvals. City bureaucracy moved at its own pace under the best of circumstances, but Richard's relationships with key officials had ensured that Marcus's projects moved through the approval process more quickly than average. Without that quiet advocacy, Marcus would experience the same delays and frustrations that plagued most architects dealing with municipal regulations. The third sign would be the gradual reduction in referrals and recommendations. Much of Marcus's business came from word-of-mouth recommendations within the construction and development community. Richard's reputation and relationships had opened doors for his son that might not have opened otherwise. As those relationships neutralized their support for Marcus, the flow of new opportunities would naturally decrease. Richard understood that he was essentially engineering his son's professional difficulties, but he also understood that those difficulties would reveal the true extent of Marcus's capabilities. If Marcus was genuinely the self-made success he claimed to be, he should be able to overcome these challenges through his own talent and determination. If not, then perhaps he would gain a new appreciation for the support he had previously received without acknowledgement. The lawsuit sitting on Richard's desk represented more than a demand for money. It was a fundamental challenge to Richard's identity as a father. Marcus's claims of abandonment and neglect struck at the heart of everything Richard had sacrificed over the years to build a better life for his son. The money demanded in the suit was substantial, but the emotional damage was incalculable. Richard picked up the lawsuit and read through it again, paying particular attention to the specific allegations. Marcus claimed that Richard's absence during his childhood had caused lasting psychological damage. He alleged that the lack of paternal support had forced him to struggle unnecessarily through college and the early years of his career. He claimed that Richard's focus on building wealth had come at the expense of building a relationship with his son, causing both emotional and financial harm. Each allegation was crafted to present Richard as a selfish, negligent father who had failed in his most basic responsibilities. The lawsuit painted Marcus as a victim who had overcome tremendous obstacles to achieve success despite his father's abandonment. It was a compelling narrative, and Richard could see how a jury might find it persuasive if they didn't know the complete truth about his involvement in Marcus's life. But Richard did know the complete truth, and he had the documentation to prove it. The question now was how to use that truth most effectively. He could simply respond to the lawsuit with evidence of his support, seeking to discredit Marcus's claims and potentially countersuing for defamation. But that approach would likely escalate the conflict and possibly destroy any remaining hope of reconciling with his son. Alternatively, Richard could use the lawsuit as an opportunity to finally reveal the full extent of his involvement in Marcus's life, not as a legal defense, but as a father's final attempt to bridge the gap between them. The revelation would be shocking to Marcus, who had no idea how much his father had done behind the scenes. It might lead to understanding and reconciliation, or it might deepen the resentment between them. Richard made his decision. He would respond to the lawsuit not by fighting Marcus's claims, but by accepting them completely. If Marcus believed he had received no support from his father, then Richard would ensure that belief become reality going forward. The comprehensive accounting Patricia was preparing would serve not as a legal defense, but as a roadmap for withdrawing every form of support Richard had provided over the years. Marcus wanted independence from his father. Richard was going to give him exactly that, retroactively and going forward. The lesson would be painful for both of them, but it might be the only way to finally establish an honest relationship based on truth rather than misperception. Richard reached for his phone and dialed Gerald Hoffman's number again. When his attorney answered, Richard's voice was calm and determined. "Gerald, I've made my decision about how to respond to Marcus's lawsuit. I want you to draft a response that accepts all his claims about my failure to provide support. Then I want you to include a detailed accounting of every form of assistance I actually provided, structured not as a defense, but as an acknowledgement that such support was inappropriate and will be terminated immediately." "Richard, that's an extraordinarily unusual legal strategy. I'm not sure a judge would even know how to interpret such a response." "The judge doesn't need to understand it," Richard replied. "My son needs to understand it, and he will eventually." As Richard hung up the phone, he felt the weight of the decision he had made. The coming months would be difficult for both him and Marcus, but they will also be illuminating. For the first time in 20 years, Marcus will experience life without his father's hidden support. And for the first time in 20 years, Richard would discover whether the son he had tried so hard to help could truly succeed on his own merit. The war between father and son was about to begin, and Richard intended to win it not through destroying Marcus, but through finally showing him the truth about their relationship. It was a dangerous gamble, but Richard had spent his entire career taking calculated risks. This would be the most important risk he had ever taken, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The next phase of Richard's plan would require patience and precision. He needed to coordinate the withdrawal of support carefully, ensuring that Marcus experienced the consequences of true independence without being completely destroyed by them.
It was a delicate balance between teaching a lesson and inflicting punishment, and Richard was determined to stay on the right side of that line. Marcus had claimed he never received anything from his father. Richard was about to find out whether that claim could survive becoming reality. The first domino fell 3 weeks after Richard sent his emails. Marcus called on a Tuesday morning, his voice tight with frustration but not yet panicked. Richard was reviewing construction schedules when his phone rang, and he almost didn't answer when he saw his son's name on the display. "Dad, I need to ask you something," Marcus began without pleasantries. "Have you had any recent dealings with the Meridian building ownership? My office lease is up for renewal, and they're demanding a 60% increase. That's completely unreasonable for a space I've been renting without problems for 3 years." Richard kept his voice neutral. "I don't believe Holloway Industries has any current projects involving the Meridian building. What reason did they give for the increase?" "They claim the previous rate was a promotional lease that's no longer available. But I never signed anything that mentioned promotional rates. The property manager is being evasive about the details." Marcus paused, and Richard could hear papers rustling in the background. "I was hoping you might know someone in commercial real estate who could help me understand what's happening." The irony of his son asking for the very type of behind-the-scenes assistance that Richard was systematically withdrawing wasn't lost on him. For years, Marcus had benefited from exactly this kind of help without ever realizing it. Now, facing his first real obstacle without his father's invisible network, he instinctively turned to Richard for support. "Commercial real estate can be complicated," Richard said carefully. "Lease terms sometimes change when buildings change hands or when management companies reassess their portfolios. Have you considered looking for alternative spaces?" "Dad, this location is crucial for my business. Half my clients expect to meet me in a prestigious downtown address. Moving to some suburban office park would hurt my firm's image." Marcus's voice carried the strain of someone encountering an unexpected problem. "I've built my reputation partly on the impression that I'm successful enough to afford prime real estate." Richard felt a pang of sympathy for his son, but he forced himself to maintain his course. Success often requires adapting to changing circumstances. Maybe this is an opportunity to explore different options. "That's easy for you to say," Marcus replied, his tone sharpening. "You own your building. You don't have to worry about landlords changing terms arbitrarily. Some of us have to deal with these problems without the luxury of complete control over our business environment." The comment stung because it revealed how little Marcus understood about Richard's early struggles. Richard had worked for 15 years before he could afford to purchase his first building, spending countless nights worrying about lease renewals and arbitrary rent increases just like his son was experiencing now. But Marcus had never asked about his father's early career, preferring to maintain his narrative about Richard's supposed advantages. After ending the call, Richard sat quietly in his office, contemplating the conversation. Marcus's request for help had been indirect but clear, and Richard's refusal to provide it had been equally clear. It was the first time in years that Richard had declined to use his connections on his son's behalf, and the change in dynamic was already apparent. The lease situation would force Marcus to make his first significant business decision without his father's safety net. Richard had arranged the below-market lease 3 years earlier through a complex web of subsidiary companies and business relationships that Marcus had never suspected. The property management company had been happy to offer the discounted rate in exchange for Richard's promise to consider the Meridian building for future Holloway Industries projects. Now that Richard had withdrawn that implicit guarantee, the property managers were treating Marcus like any other tenant. The 60% increase brought his rent in line with market rates for similar spaces, rates that most small architectural firms couldn't afford without significantly impacting their profitability. Marcus would have to choose between accepting the higher rent and reducing his firm's margins, or finding a less expensive space and potentially losing the prestige that had helped attract high-end clients. Either choice would force him to confront the financial realities that Richard's support had previously shielded him from. The second domino fell 2 weeks later. Marcus's permit for the Riverside Commons project, a luxury residential development that represented his largest contract to date, encountered unexpected delays in the city planning office. The project had been moving smoothly through the approval process, but suddenly the plans were flagged for additional environmental reviews that could take months to complete. Marcus called Richard again, this time with barely controlled anger in his voice. "Dad, something strange is happening with my Riverside Commons project. The city planning office has suddenly decided they need additional environmental impact studies, even though the site has already been approved for similar development twice in the past decade. The delays could cost me the entire contract if I can't meet the construction timeline." Richard maintained his neutral tone. Environmental regulations have become stricter in recent years. Perhaps the city is being more thorough with their reviews. "This isn't about thoroughness," Marcus snapped. "This is about bureaucratic incompetence or worse. The planning director won't even return my calls. I've left 6 messages in the past week." His frustration was evident, but there was also something else in his voice, a hint of desperation that Richard had never heard before. "Have you tried working through a consultant who specializes in municipal approvals?" Richard suggested. "Sometimes an experienced intermediary can help navigate these situations." "I can't afford to hire consultants for every project. My overhead is already stretched with the new office rent situation." Marcus paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had a pleading quality that made Richard's chest tighten. "Dad, you've been doing business in this city for 30 years. You must know people in the planning office. Could you make a few calls?" There it was, the direct request for exactly the kind of assistance Richard had been providing invisibly for years. In the past, Marcus would never have needed to ask, because Richard would have already resolved the issue before his son even knew it existed. Now, facing his first real bureaucratic obstacle, Marcus was discovering how difficult it could be to navigate city government without connections. Richard had cultivated relationships with key municipal officials over decades of construction projects. His reputation and track record meant that his calls got returned promptly and his concerns were taken seriously. Marcus was learning that without those relationships, even legitimate projects could get buried in bureaucratic delays. "Marcus, I think it's important for you to handle this situation through proper channels," Richard said, each word carefully chosen. "You're a professional architect with a legitimate project. The system should work for you without requiring personal favors." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was cold. "I see. So when I need actual help with a real problem, you're suddenly interested in proper channels? But when you need to feel better about our relationship, you're happy to throw money at birthday gifts and Christmas presents?"
The accusation was unfair, but revealing. Marcus still saw their relationship primarily in terms of material gifts rather than substantive support, because the substantive support had always been invisible to him. He was angry that Richard wouldn't help with his current crisis, but he had no idea that Richard's help had been preventing similar crises for years. "I want you to succeed on your own merits," Richard said finally. "You've always told everyone how capable and independent you are. This is an opportunity to prove that." "Right, independence. I should have known that would be your response." Marcus's bitterness was palpable. "God forbid you should actually act like a father when your son needs help." The call ended abruptly, leaving Richard staring at his phone and questioning his strategy. He had expected Marcus to struggle with the withdrawal of support, but he hadn't fully considered how that struggle would affect their already fragile relationship. Each obstacle Marcus encountered was pushing him further away rather than helping him understand what he had lost. Richard spent the rest of the day reviewing the environmental impact requirements that were delaying Marcus's project. The delays were legitimate under current regulations, but Richard knew that with the right approach, they could be expedited through the system. A single phone call to Planning Director Catherine Walsh would probably resolve the issue within a week. Catherine owed Richard numerous favors from past projects where his company had exceeded environmental standards and contributed to community development funds. She had streamlined approvals for Marcus's previous projects as a courtesy to Richard, though Marcus had never known about those conversations. Richard reached for his phone twice that afternoon, then stopped himself both times.
Marcus needed to learn that success in business often depended on relationships and reputation that took years to build. The environmental review delays were teaching him that lesson more effectively than any explanation Richard could offer. The third domino began falling a month later, though its effects would take longer to become apparent. Marcus's firm had built its client base largely through referrals from satisfied customers and recommendations from other professionals in the construction industry. Those recommendations had often come from contractors, engineers, and developers who worked regularly with Holloway Industries and wanted to maintain good relationships with Richard. The referral network that had quietly supported Marcus's business growth was based on Richard's reputation and relationships, though Marcus had always attributed his success to the quality of his own work. When Richard sent discreet messages to his professional contacts explaining that they should no longer consider his relationship with Marcus as a factor in their business decisions, the flow of new opportunities began to slow. The change wasn't dramatic enough to be immediately noticeable. Marcus still had existing projects to complete and a small pipeline of potential work. But the steady stream of new inquiries and referrals that had sustained his firm's growth gradually diminished. Projects that might have been directed to Marcus Holloway Architectural Design went to other firms instead. Marcus first mentioned the slowdown during a phone call 6 weeks later, though he didn't yet understand its significance. "Business has been a bit quiet lately," he told Richard during one of their increasingly infrequent conversations. "I'm not sure if it's a seasonal thing or if the market is softening. Some of the contractors I usually work with seem to be recommending other architects for their projects." Richard made non-committal sounds of sympathy while privately noting that Marcus still didn't suspect the real cause of his difficulties. His son continued to view each problem as an isolated incident rather than recognizing the pattern of withdrawn support. "The Riderside Commons delays haven't helped," Marcus continued. "That project was supposed to be a showcase that would lead to more high-end residential work. Now it's stuck in environmental review limbo, and potential clients are starting to question whether I can deliver projects on schedule." The environmental review had eventually been completed, but not before causing a 3-month delay that put Marcus's firm in breach of its timeline commitments. The client had agreed to extend the deadline, but had also negotiated a reduction in fees as compensation for the delay. The financial impact was significant for a small firm operating on thin margins. "These kinds of setbacks are part of business," Richard offered, though he knew the advice was cold comfort to someone facing real financial pressure. "Easy for you to say," Marcus replied with familiar bitterness. "Your company is established enough to absorb delays and cost overruns. I'm still building my reputation, and every problem becomes a potential crisis." Richard recognized the irony in his son's words. Marcus was describing exactly the situation Richard had worked so hard to shield him from over the years. The invisible support network had been designed to prevent the kinds of problems Marcus was now experiencing, allowing him to build his reputation without the typical struggles of a new business owner. Now that the support was gone, Marcus was discovering what most entrepreneurs learned the hard way, that success often depended as much on luck, timing, and relationships as it did on talent and hard work. The lesson was painful but necessary if Marcus was ever going to understand the true value of what his father had provided. The fourth domino was the most personal. Marcus's relationship with Elena Castilla had been one of the few bright spots in his life over the past year. Elena was an interior designer who worked with several architectural firms in the city, and she and Marcus had met through a professional collaboration that had blossomed into romance. What Marcus didn't know was that Elena's introduction to his firm had come through Richard's network. One of Holloway Industries' longtime partners, a commercial development company, had recommended Marcus's services to Elena when she needed an architect for a restaurant renovation project. The recommendation had been made at Richard's subtle suggestion, though Elena had no idea about the connection. The relationship had deepened over months of working together and socializing within their shared professional circles. Elena was intelligent, ambitious, and genuinely seemed to care for Marcus beyond his professional success. Richard had watched their relationship develop with cautious optimism, hoping that Elena might provide the emotional support and perspective that could help Marcus mature. But Elena's business also depended on referrals and recommendations from the same network that had been supporting Marcus. When Richard withdrew his quiet endorsements, Elena's access to certain opportunities began to change as well. Projects that might have been directed to her through Richard's connections went elsewhere instead. The shift was subtle enough that Elena initially attributed it to normal business fluctuations. But as weeks passed and the pattern became more apparent, she began to reassess her professional relationships, including her connection to Marcus. The conversation that ended their relationship took place on a rainy Thursday evening in Marcus's apartment. Richard learned about it only because Marcus called him afterward, drunk and angry and needing someone to blame for his latest disappointment. "Elena broke up with me tonight," Marcus announced, without preamble when Richard answered his phone. "Apparently, dating me is bad for her business. She didn't say it directly, but that's what it comes down to." Richard felt a stab of guilt. He hadn't intended for his withdrawal of support to affect Marcus's personal relationships, but he should have anticipated that professional and personal connections often overlap in their industry. "I'm sorry to hear that," Richard said sincerely. "What exactly did she say?" "She gave me some nonsense about needing to focus on her career and not being ready for a serious relationship, but I could tell there was more to it." Marcus's words were slightly slurred, and Richard could hear the clink of ice cubes against glass in the background. "She's been acting strange for weeks, like she's worried about something." Richard remained silent, knowing that anything he said would likely make the situation worse. "You know what the real problem is?" Marcus continued, his voice growing louder. "Everything in this city runs on connections and insider deals. If you don't have the right relationships, you get frozen out. Elena figured out that being associated with me isn't helping her career anymore." The observation was more perceptive than Marcus realized. He was beginning to understand that professional success often depended on networks and relationships, though he still didn't grasp how much those factors had influenced his own career trajectory.
Maybe she was being honest about needing to focus on her work, Richard suggested carefully. Young professionals often struggle to balance career demands with personal relationships. "Don't give me that corporate wisdom bullshit," Marcus snapped. "This is about power and politics, and we both know it. Some people have connections that open doors, and others have to fight for everything they get." The irony was almost unbearable. Marcus was describing exactly the dynamic that had benefited him for years, but he was casting himself as the victim rather than recognizing that he had been one of the privileged few with powerful connections working behind the scenes. "Marcus, success in business has always involved relationships and reputation. That's true in every industry." "Yeah, well, some of us didn't inherit those relationships. Some of us have to build them from scratch while competing against people who got a head start." Marcus's bitterness was growing with each drink. "Elena probably figured out that I'm not connected enough to be worth the investment." Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every choice he had made over the past months. His son was in pain, and that pain was partly Richard's doing. But Marcus was also finally beginning to understand realities about business and success that he had never had to confront before. "What are you going to do now?" Richard asked. "What choice do I have? Keep working, keep trying to build my business, keep pretending that talent and hard work are enough." Marcus laughed bitterly. "Maybe, eventually, I'll figure out how this game really works." The call ended with Marcus hanging up abruptly, leaving Richard alone with the consequences of his strategy. His son was learning important lessons about independence and self-reliance, but the education was coming at a higher emotional cost than Richard had anticipated. Over the following weeks, Richard watched from a distance as Marcus struggled with the compound effects of his professional and personal setbacks. The office rent increase had forced him to move to a less prestigious location on the outskirts of downtown. The project delays had damaged his reputation with several potential clients. The reduction in referrals was making it harder to replace completed projects with new work. Most significantly, Marcus was beginning to show signs of real financial stress for the first time in his adult life. He had been forced to lay off one of his 4 employees and had stopped taking his full salary to preserve cash flow.
The German sports car he had purchased during better times was now for sale, and he had moved from his upscale apartment to a smaller place in a less fashionable neighborhood. Richard received updates on his son's situation through the same network of professional contacts that had once supported Marcus's career. The reports were factual but concerning. Marcus was working longer hours, taking on smaller projects he would have previously declined, and showing visible stress that clients and colleagues were beginning to notice. The temptation to intervene grew stronger with each report. Richard could resolve most of Marcus's problems with a few phone calls and strategic applications of his influence. The environmental review delays could be expedited. The referral network could be reactivated. Even Elena might reconsider her decision if she knew that her career wouldn't suffer from associating with Marcus. But Richard forced himself to maintain his course. Marcus had spent years claiming that he had succeeded without help, that he was entirely self-made, that his father's absence had forced him to become independent and capable. Those claims were now being tested by reality, and the results were revealing important truths about both Marcus's capabilities and the support structure he had taken for granted. The most difficult moment came when Patricia Chen presented Richard with the comprehensive financial accounting he had requested. The document was 3 inches thick and detailed every form of support Richard had provided over 20 years. The total value was staggering, $4.8 million when all direct and indirect benefits were calculated. "This is extraordinary, Richard," Patricia said as she walked him through the analysis. "I had no idea the extent of your involvement in Marcus's career. The below-market leases alone saved him nearly $300,000 over 5 years. The expedited permits probably saved him at least $100,000 in consulting fees and delay costs." Richard studied the numbers, seeing his 2 decades of sacrifice quantified in spreadsheets and charts. Every late night spent cultivating relationships that would benefit Marcus. Every favor called in to smooth his son's path. Every dollar spent or saved on Marcus's behalf, while Richard himself lived modestly and reinvested most of his profits back into his business. "The most significant item is probably the opportunity cost," Patricia continued. "The business you directed away from your own company to create opportunities for Marcus's firm represents millions in foregone revenue. You essentially subsidized your son's success by accepting smaller margins and fewer projects for Holloway Industries." That revelation surprised even Richard. He had known he was making sacrifices to help Marcus, but he hadn't calculated the full economic impact of his choices. The accounting showed that he had prioritized his son's success over his own company's growth, creating artificial opportunities that had allowed Marcus to build a reputation and client base he might never have achieved through pure competition. "What are you going to do with this information?" Patricia asked. Richard considered his options. The accounting could serve as the foundation for a devastating countersuit that would not only defeat Marcus's claims but potentially bankrupt him. It could be used as leverage to force Marcus to acknowledge his father's contributions and withdraw his lawsuit. Or it could remain private, serving only to inform Richard's understanding of the true cost of his invisible support. "For now, keep it confidential," Richard decided, "but I want you to prepare a summary version that focuses on the key categories of support, something that could be understood by someone without an accounting background. Are you planning to share this with Marcus?" "Eventually," Richard replied, "but not yet. He needs to experience more of what life looks like without support before he's ready to understand what he actually lost." The accounting had one more revelation that Patricia saved for last. "Richard, there's something else you should know. Based on Marcus's current financial situation and the trajectory of his business, he's going to face serious problems within the next 6 months if things don't improve. The lawsuit he filed against you is probably his attempt to solve a cash flow crisis that he doesn't want to admit." Richard felt his stomach drop. How serious? Without new revenue or a significant injection of capital, his firm will likely be insolvent within 4 months. He's already mortgaged his remaining assets and maxed out his business credit lines. The lawsuit might be his only hope of generating enough money to save his company. The revelation recontextualized everything Richard thought he knew about Marcus's motivations.
His son wasn't just striking out in anger or seeking validation, he was fighting for his professional survival. The withdrawal of Richard's support had created exactly the kind of crisis that Richard had always tried to prevent. But it also meant that Marcus was finally experiencing the natural consequences of building a business without adequate financial reserves or diversified income streams. The success that Richard had helped orchestrate had allowed Marcus to take risks and make commitments that might have been unwise for someone truly operating without a safety net. Now Marcus was learning those lessons the hard way, and Richard faced a choice that would determine not only the outcome of their conflict, but the future of their relationship.
He could continue his strategy of withdrawn support and watch his son's business fail, or he could intervene to prevent a collapse that might destroy Marcus financially and emotionally. The decision would define what kind of father Richard truly was and what kind of man Marcus would become. The war between them was approaching its climax, and both sides were running out of options. Richard looked out his office window at the city skyline, seeing it now not as a symbol of his success, but as the battleground where his son's future would be decided. The choice he made in the coming days would echo through both their lives for years to come, and there was no guarantee that either of them would emerge from the conflict intact. The phone on his desk remained silent, but Richard knew it would ring soon. Marcus would reach out again, either in desperation or defiance, and Richard would have to decide whether to extend a hand or maintain the painful distance he had created. The lesson in independence was nearly complete, but the final exam would test both father and son in ways neither of them had anticipated. The crisis Richard had been anticipating finally arrived on a cold February morning, delivered not through a phone call but through an unexpected visitor at his office. Meredith Walsh, Marcus's assistant and one of the few employees he hadn't been forced to lay off, appeared at Holloway Industries without an appointment, her professional composure cracking under obvious strain. "Mr. Holloway, I'm sorry to bother you, but I didn't know who else to turn to," she said when Richard's secretary ushered her into his office. "It's about Marcus. I think he's in serious trouble, and I don't think he's going to ask for help until it's too late." Richard gestured for her to sit, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands shook slightly as she clutched her purse. Meredith had been with Marcus's firm for 2 years, hired during the prosperous period when Richard's invisible support had kept opportunities flowing steadily. She was competent and loyal, qualities that made her one of the few people who truly understood the scope of Marcus's current difficulties. "What kind of trouble?" Richard asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Financial trouble, the worst kind." Meredith took a shaky breath. "He's been hiding it from everyone, but I handle the books, so I can see what's happening. We haven't paid rent on the new office in 2 months. 3 vendors have sent final notices for past due invoices. The payroll account doesn't have enough to cover my salary next week, though he keeps telling me not to worry." Richard felt his chest tighten. Patricia's projections had been accurate, but hearing the details from someone who witnessed Marcus's daily struggle made the situation feel more immediate and personal. "Has he tried to secure additional financing?" Richard asked. Meredith shook her head. "He applied for another business loan last month, but the bank turned him down. His debt-to-income ratio is too high, and the firm doesn't have enough steady contracts to justify additional credit." She paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. "Mr. Holloway, Marcus has been working 18-hour days, taking on projects that barely cover their costs, trying to save the business. I've never seen anyone push themselves so hard." The image of his son working desperately to salvage his failing company stirred emotions Richard had been suppressing for months. He had wanted Marcus to experience real challenge, to understand the value of the support he had taken for granted, but he hadn't intended to watch his son destroy himself in the process. "Why were you telling me this?" Richard asked carefully. "Because I know there's more to your relationship than Marcus talks about," Meredith replied with surprising directness. I've worked in this industry long enough to recognize when someone has connections and advantages they don't acknowledge. Marcus's success over the past few years was impressive, but it was also unusual for someone so young without family money or established industry relationships. Richard studied the young woman across from his desk. She was more perceptive than he had given her credit for, and her loyalty to Marcus was evident in her willingness to approach his father despite knowing about their strained relationship. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to consider that maybe Marcus learned the wrong lesson from his success," Meredith said, her voice growing stronger. "He genuinely believes he built his business entirely through his own efforts. That belief gave him confidence, but it also made him overconfident. He took risks and made commitments based on an inflated sense of his own capabilities. The observation was astute and painful in its accuracy. Richard's hidden support had indeed created a distorted feedback loop where Marcus's successes reinforced his belief in his own invincibility without revealing the safety net that made those successes possible. Now he's facing the natural consequences of those overconfident decisions," Meredith continued. "But he's also facing them alone, without the support system that was apparently there before but isn't anymore. I don't know what changed, but something did." Richard remained silent, unwilling to confirm or deny her suspicions about his previous involvement. "He's going to lose everything," Meredith said quietly. "The business, his reputation, probably his sanity if he keeps pushing himself like this. And for what? To prove a point about independence? To satisfy some principle about self-reliance?" Her voice cracked slightly. "He's a good person, Mr. Holloway. He pays me more than he can afford because he knows I'm supporting my mother. He works weekends to meet deadlines so his clients don't suffer. He doesn't deserve to be destroyed by whatever lesson he's supposed to be learning." The conversation lasted another 20 minutes, with Meredith providing details about Marcus's situation that painted an increasingly desperate picture. He had sold his car and most of his furniture to generate cash flow. He had moved to a studio apartment in a neighborhood that required a 40-minute commute to his office. Most concerning, he had stopped eating regular meals and was showing signs of severe stress that worried everyone who worked with him. After Meredith left, Richard sat alone in his office for hours, staring out at the city where his son was fighting a battle he was destined to lose. The accounting Patricia had prepared sat in his desk drawer, a comprehensive record of every advantage Richard had provided over the years. The document represented both the full extent of Marcus's debt to his father and the complete scope of what Marcus was about to lose. Richard opened the drawer and pulled out the summary version Patricia had created. 20 pages of careful analysis that revealed the true foundation of Marcus's previous success. Direct financial support totaling $800,000. Indirect benefits worth over $2 million. Opportunity costs to Richard's own business exceeding $1.5 million. The numbers were staggering, but they were also irrelevant if Marcus's business collapsed before he could understand their significance. The phone call Richard had been expecting finally came that evening. Marcus's voice was barely recognizable, hoarse with exhaustion and defeat. "Dad, I need to tell you something," Marcus began, his usual defensiveness replaced by hollow resignation. "I'm dropping the lawsuit." Richard felt a complex mixture of relief and sorrow.
Why? Because I can't afford the attorney fees anymore, and because it doesn't matter anyway. Marcus's laugh was bitter and empty. I'm going to lose everything regardless. At least this way, I won't waste what little money I have left on legal bills. Marcus, what's happening with your business? What business? Marcus replied. I'm 3 months behind on rent. My employees are looking for other jobs, and I have maybe 6 weeks of operating capital left if I'm lucky. The raw honesty was unlike anything Richard had heard from his son in years. I thought I could make it work. I thought if I just worked harder and smarter, I could overcome the obstacles. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. What obstacles? Everything, Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly. The lease situation, the permit delays, the clients who stopped returning calls, the referrals that dried up. It's like the whole industry turned against me simultaneously, and I can't figure out what I did wrong. The pain in his son's voice was almost unbearable. Marcus was describing the natural consequences of losing his father's support network, but he was experiencing them as inexplicable persecution. He had no framework for understanding what was happening because he had never known the support existed in the first place. Sometimes business cycles are unpredictable, Richard offered weakly. No, Dad, this isn't a business cycle, Marcus replied with sudden sharpness. This is systematic. It's like someone flipped a switch and all my professional relationships changed overnight. The contractors who used to recommend me to their clients suddenly started suggesting other firms. The city officials who used to expedite my permits started treating me like any other applicant. Even Elena pulled away because she said being associated with me was affecting her own opportunities. Marcus was closer to the truth than Richard had expected. His son's analytical mind was beginning to piece together the pattern, even if he couldn't identify the cause. "What are you going to do?" Richard asked. "I'm going to keep fighting until I can't anymore," Marcus said. "I'll take any project I can get, work as many hours as it takes, sacrifice whatever I need to sacrifice. And if you can't?" There was a long silence before Marcus answered. "Then I'll have to accept that maybe I was never as capable as I thought I was. Maybe my early success was just luck, and now my luck has run out." The self-recrimination in Marcus's voice cut through Richard like a blade. His son was internalizing the failures, blaming himself for problems that were largely created by the withdrawal of support he had never known existed. The lesson Richard had intended to teach about appreciation and humility was becoming a destructive spiral of self-doubt and despair. After the call ended, Richard walked to his office window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere among those lights, his son was probably still working, pushing himself toward exhaustion in a desperate attempt to save a business that Richard could rescue with a single phone call. The moral complexity of the situation was overwhelming. Marcus needed to learn important lessons about humility, gratitude, and the reality of how success actually worked in the business world. But he was learning those lessons at a cost that might permanently damage his confidence, his health, and his future prospects. Richard made his decision. He reached for his phone and dialed Gerald Hoffman's home number. "Gerald, it's Richard. I need you to prepare a comprehensive response to Marcus's lawsuit, but not the kind we discussed before. I thought Marcus was dropping the suit. He is, but I'm not going to let him." Richard's voice was steady with newfound resolve. "I want you to file a countersuit that lays out everything I've done for Marcus over the past 20 years. Every dollar spent, every favor called in, every advantage provided. I want it all documented and presented as evidence of my actual performance as a father." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Richard, that's going to be a very public revelation. Once it's part of court records, Marcus won't be able to pretend he didn't know about your support." "Good," Richard replied. "It's time for both of us to stop pretending." The countersuit Gerald prepared was devastating in its thoroughness. Patricia's financial accounting served as the foundation, but Gerald added legal context that transformed the dry numbers into a compelling narrative of paternal sacrifice and support. The document detailed not just the monetary value of Richard's contributions, but the strategic thinking and relationship building that had made Marcus's success possible. The countersuit sought no monetary damages from Marcus, but it demanded something more valuable: public acknowledgement of Richard's contributions and a formal apology for the false accusations in the original lawsuit. More importantly, it included an offer that would resolve the entire conflict if Marcus was willing to accept it. Richard proposed to restart all the support he had previously provided, but with full transparency going forward. Marcus would know about every connection made on his behalf, every favor called in, every advantage provided. In exchange, Marcus would acknowledge the reality of their relationship and work with Richard to build something honest and sustainable. The countersuit was filed on a Wednesday morning, and Marcus received his copy that afternoon.
Richard's phone rang within an hour of delivery. "What the hell is this?" Marcus's voice was a mixture of shock, anger, and something that might have been hope. "It's the truth," Richard replied calmly. "Everything I've done for you over the past 20 years, documented with receipts and bank statements and witness testimony. You're claiming you spent over $4 million supporting me?" Marcus's voice rose with incredulity. "That's impossible. I would have known about something like that. Would you? When did you ever ask where your opportunities came from? When did you question why your permits moved faster than average, or why contractors recommended your services to their clients?" Richard kept his tone level, factual. "You were so committed to believing you were self-made that you never examined the evidence to the contrary." Marcus was quiet for a long time, and Richard could hear pages rustling as his son worked through the documentation. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was smaller, more uncertain. "The lease on the Meridian building?"
You arranged that? My subsidiary company guaranteed it in exchange for Holloway Industries committing to future projects with the building management firm. The environmental review delays on Riverside Commons, you could have prevented those? One phone call to Catherine Walsh would have expedited the process. I made those calls for your previous projects. Elena, her decision to end our relationship, that was because of something you did? Richard hesitated, knowing this answer would hurt the most. When I withdrew my informal endorsements from the professional network, it affected everyone who had been benefiting from their association with you. Elena's business depended on referrals from the same sources that had been supporting yours. The silence stretched for several minutes. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "So, nothing I accomplished was real? Everything was because of you pulling strings behind the scenes?" "No," Richard said firmly. "Your talent is real, your work ethic is real, your creativity and problem-solving abilities are real. What I provided was opportunity and reduced friction. You still had to perform once you got the chances. But I would never have gotten the chances without you." "Maybe not as easily or as early in your career," Richard admitted. "But Marcus, every successful person benefits from some combination of talent, hard work, and advantages. The advantages I provided were unusual in their scope, but they weren't unique in their existence." Another long pause, followed by Marcus's bitter laugh. "So, the lawsuit was pointless? I was suing you for not supporting me while you were supporting me in ways I never imagined." "The lawsuit was pointless for different reasons," Richard replied. "It was based on your perception of our relationship rather than the reality. But perceptions matter, Marcus. If you genuinely felt abandoned and neglected, then I failed as a father regardless of how much money I spent or how many strings I pulled." "So, what happens now?" Marcus asked. "You've proven your point, you've shown me how dependent I actually was on your help. You've demonstrated that my success was largely artificial. What's the end game here?" Richard took a deep breath, knowing his next words would determine the future of their relationship. "The end game is honesty," he said. "I'm offering to resume supporting your business, but with complete transparency this time. You'll know about every call I make, every favor I ask, every advantage I provide. In exchange, you'll acknowledge that success often requires help, and that accepting help doesn't diminish your own contributions." "And if I refuse?" "Then you continue on your current path, and we both live with the consequences," Richard replied. "But Marcus, I don't want to watch you destroy yourself trying to prove a point about independence. You're talented enough to succeed with support, and stubborn enough to fail without it." Marcus was quiet for so long that Richard began to wonder if the call had been disconnected. When his son finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to come from deep in his bones. "I need time to think about this," Marcus said. "I need to process what you've told me and figure out how I feel about it." "Take all the time you need," Richard replied. "But Marcus, while you're thinking, remember that pride and independence are valuable qualities, but they're not worth destroying yourself to preserve. The call ended without resolution, leaving Richard to wait for his son's decision. The next few days passed slowly, with Richard finding it difficult to concentrate on his work while Marcus wrestled with the revelations about their relationship. The answer came not through a phone call, but through a visit. Marcus appeared at Holloway Industries on a Friday afternoon, looking haggard but determined. Richard's secretary announced his arrival, and Richard felt his pulse quicken as he prepared for what might be their most important conversation. Marcus entered the office carrying a folder and wearing the same serious expression he had worn as a child when preparing to confess some misbehavior. He sat across from Richard's desk and placed the folder between them. "I've been thinking about your offer," Marcus began, his voice steady but tired. "And I've been thinking about everything I learned from your countersuit documentation." Richard nodded but remained silent, letting his son set the pace of the conversation. "I have some questions," Marcus continued, "and I need honest answers if we're going to move forward with any kind of relationship." Marcus opened his folder and pulled out several pages of handwritten notes. "First question, did you arrange for me to get the job at Thornfield Associates?" "I didn't arrange it directly, but I made sure James Thornfield knew you were available and qualified when the position opened up." Second question, "The scholarship program that paid for my SAT tutoring, was that you?" "Yes, I created it specifically for you, though it was designed to help other students as well." "The vintage Mustang for my 16th birthday. Mom said she surprised me with it, but she didn't have that kind of money." "I bought it and arranged for her to present it to you." Marcus worked through his list methodically, asking about dozens of instances where he had suspected outside influence but had never investigated further. With each confirmation, Richard watched his son's understanding of their relationship shift and deepen. "Last question," Marcus said when he reached the bottom of his notes. "Why did you stop? What changed that made you withdraw all the support?" Richard had been dreading this question because it required him to confront his own motivations honestly. "Because I realized that my invisible support was enabling your belief that you didn't need help from anyone. Every time you succeeded, you attributed it entirely to your own efforts. Every time you spoke publicly about being self-made, it reinforced a narrative that wasn't true. So you decided to teach me a lesson by letting me fail. I decided to teach you a lesson by showing you what independence actually looks like," Richard corrected. "I hoped that experiencing real challenges would help you appreciate the support you had been receiving." Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing the explanation. "And it worked, didn't it? I've spent the last 6 months learning exactly how difficult it is to succeed without connections, without advantages, without someone smoothing the path ahead of you." "Yes, it worked," Richard admitted. "But the cost was higher than I anticipated. I didn't want to watch you suffer. I wanted you to gain perspective." "Well, I've gained perspective," Marcus said with a slight smile that was the first genuine expression Richard had seen from him in months. "I've learned that I was incredibly naive about how business works, incredibly ungrateful for advantages I didn't recognize, and incredibly wrong about my own capabilities." Richard felt a flash of concern. "Marcus, don't discount your own abilities. The support I provided was significant, but it wasn't everything. You still had to deliver quality work and build client relationships." "I know," Marcus replied. "But I also know that I built those client relationships and delivered that quality work from a position of strength that you created and maintained. Without that foundation, I discovered pretty quickly how vulnerable a small business can be." They sat in silence for a moment, both contemplating the complexity of their relationship and the damage that had been done by years of misunderstanding. "I want to accept your offer," Marcus said finally. "I want you to help me rebuild my business, but with transparency this time. I want to understand how your support works and what I'm contributing independently." Relief flooded through Richard, mixed with gratitude that his son was willing to start over with honesty between them. "What made you decide?" "Partly practical necessity," Marcus admitted. "My business is going to fail without help, and I'm too tired and too broke to let pride destroy what's left of my career." He paused, then continued with more emotion.
but mostly because I realized that rejecting help from someone who loves you isn't independence, it's stupidity. Richard felt tears prick at his eyes, but he maintained his composure. We'll need to establish clear boundaries and expectations. Agreed, Marcus said. I've made a list of what I think I need most urgently, and I want you to tell me honestly what you can and can't provide. They spent the next 2 hours working through the practical details of rebuilding Marcus's business. Richard agreed to make strategic phone calls to restart the referral network, but only after explaining to Marcus exactly who he was calling and why those relationships mattered. He offered to help with the office lease situation, but with Marcus understanding the full cost and implications of the assistance. Most importantly, they established a new framework for their personal relationship. Marcus acknowledged that he had been unfair in his characterizations of Richard as an absent father, while Richard acknowledged that invisible support hadn't been enough to create the emotional connection his son needed. "There's one more thing," Marcus said, as their meeting drew to a close. "I want to find a way to pay you back for what you've invested in me over the years. Not the full amount, that would take several lifetimes, but something meaningful." Richard shook his head. "That's not necessary. Supporting your success was never meant to be alone." "It's necessary for me," Marcus insisted. "I need to contribute something significant to this relationship, not just be a recipient of your generosity. Otherwise, I'll never feel like an equal partner in our family." They agreed that Marcus would work with Holloway Industries on selected projects, providing architectural services at cost while learning more about Richard's business. It wasn't traditional repayment, but it offered Marcus a way to contribute value while building a collaborative relationship with his father. As Marcus prepared to leave, he turned back to face Richard with an expression of curiosity mixed with regret. "Dad, can I ask you one more question?" "Of course." "If I hadn't filed the lawsuit, would you have ever told me the truth about everything you'd done for me?" Richard considered the question carefully. "Honestly, probably not. I would have continued supporting you invisibly because I thought that was what you wanted. The lawsuit forced both of us to confront truths we had been avoiding." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Then maybe it served a purpose after all, even though it was based on completely wrong assumptions." "Maybe it did," Richard agreed. As his son left the office, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope for the future of their relationship. The war between them had been costly for both sides, but it had also cleared away the misconceptions and resentments that had been poisoning their connection for decades. The rebuilding process wouldn't be easy or quick. Trust had been damaged, and both men would need to learn new ways of relating to each other based on honesty rather than assumption. But for the first time since Sandra had moved to California with 8-year-old Marcus, Richard believed that he and his son might eventually build something genuine together. 3 months later, Marcus Holloway Architectural Design had stabilized its finances and secured several new contracts with Richard's transparent assistance. Marcus had moved back to a downtown office, though not as prestigious as his original location, and had rehired the employees he had been forced to lay off during the crisis. More importantly, Marcus and Richard had begun meeting for dinner once a week, conversations that ranged from business strategy to personal reflection. The relationship was still fragile and required careful navigation, but it was built on truth rather than misconception. The lawsuit was formally withdrawn, with Marcus issuing a public statement acknowledging that he had been mistaken about his father's level of support throughout his career. The statement was embarrassing, but necessary, serving as the final step in clearing away the false narrative that had defined their relationship for so long. Richard kept Patricia's comprehensive accounting in his desk drawer, not as a weapon or a guilt-inducing reminder, but as documentation of a father's love expressed in the only way he had known how. The numbers represented 20 years of sacrifice, but their true value lay in what they had taught both men about the complexity of family relationships and the importance of honest communication. The war between father and son was over, but the work of building peace would continue for years to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.